I still remember the exact moment he said it. His words weren't whispered, weren't hidden behind a joke. They were thrown at me like a dagger in the middle of a crowded restaurant. "You're in my backup plan," he said, leaning back in his chair, smirking like he had just delivered the punchline of a cruel joke. The world seemed to pause, every conversation around us fading into silence, as if the universe itself had stopped to witness my humiliation. I froze, my fork hovered in midair, the salad I was about to eat now meaningless. My chest tightened, and my fingers clenched into fists under the table. He didn't realize it, or maybe he did, that his words were lethal. Not to his ego, of course. That would be impossible. No, they were lethal to me, to my self-respect, to the naive trust I had foolishly placed in him. I had been nothing more than an option, a placeholder, a convenience in the grand scheme of his life. And for a brief, unbearable moment, I allowed myself to believe that maybe I hadn't noticed before, because it didn't matter. I had been blind to his intentions, swept up in the charm of someone who seemed to care, someone who had whispered promises that now rang hollow. I looked across the table at him, Daniel. He was handsome, impeccably dressed, with that same confident grin that had fooled me for months. To anyone else, he would have seemed perfect, wealthy, ambitious, smooth, and effortlessly charming. But to me, in that moment, he was nothing but cruel. His eyes darted around the room, checking to see if anyone had noticed the cruelty he had just committed. He wasn't worried about me. He was worried about his reputation. I wanted to scream. I wanted to hurl every insult I had ever held back, but I didn't. I just sat there, taking in the betrayal. There was no dramatic exit, no spectacular confrontation, just me, realizing that the person I had thought I loved, the person I had trusted, had treated me as expendable. That night, I didn't go home to cry. I didn't wallow in despair. I went home with a quiet, burning determination forming in the pit of my stomach. If he thought I was a backup plan, he had underestimated me. He had underestimated my intelligence, my courage, and, most importantly, my connections. Because Daniel didn't he know my family. He had never met them, had never seen the kind of power, influence, and respect that came naturally to them. He didn't know that while he thought he could toy with me, the very people I was related to were not the kind to tolerate disrespect toward one of their own. I realized, in that moment, that the situation was no longer about heartbreak. It was about opportunity. I spent the next few days reflecting, planning. I didn't call him, I didn't text him, and I certainly didn't make any rash decisions. Instead, I observed. I learned his routines, his social circle, and the way he flaunted his wealth and influence as if it could shield him from reality. And then, I began planting the seeds of my quiet comeback. The first step was subtle. I reconnected with my family, who had long been protective, loving, and immensely capable in ways Daniel had never imagined. My grandfather, a respected figure in business and philanthropy, had been a pillar in the city for decades. My uncle, a seasoned strategist and media mogul, commanded attention wherever he went. My aunt, with her network of influential professionals, knew every secret corridor of the social hierarchy Daniel so desperately tried to navigate. Together, they became my silent allies. They didn't need to know the full extent of Daniel's betrayal yet, because power was most effective when it moved unseen. But I told them enough, that someone had insulted me, that someone had dared to diminish me publicly, that someone had called me a mere option. And they understood immediately not just the offense, but the opportunity. I didn't need revenge in the childish sense. I didn't need to humiliate him in front of his friends or make a scene at the next dinner party. No, I had something far more effective in mind. A revelation. A revelation so public, so undeniable, that Daniel's world would be shaken to its core. Because once he realized who my family really was, the very foundation he thought he could manipulate would crumble. Meanwhile, Daniel continued with his life, oblivious to the storm quietly building in the shadows. He invited me to events, thinking he could charm me back, thinking he could manipulate me into accepting a second-place role once more. But every invitation, every casual smile, Every attempt at small talk only reminded me of the plan I was nurturing. He didn't know that my acceptance of those invitations was a strategic move, a way to gain insight, gather intel, and ensure the timing of my revelation would be perfect. I began attending social events with subtlety. I was polite, reserved, almost invisible to those who didn't matter. I watched him closely, noting every weakness, every opportunity to reveal the truth about my identity at the most impactful moment. I observed how he interacted with his friends, how he flaunted his connections, and, most importantly, how vulnerable he became when his ego was challenged. And then, I made my move. A minor gathering, a charity gala where Daniel would undoubtedly boast about his social connections and influence, became the perfect. I arrived fashionably late, wearing a gown that was elegant without being ostentatious. I walked in quietly, my presence almost unnoticed until the whispers that grew louder with every step I took. People recognized me, influential people, movers, shakers, and decision makers that Daniel had assumed were beyond my reach. And when Daniel finally saw me, his confident smirk faltered. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but it was there, the first crack in the armor he had so carefully constructed. His eyes widened, scanning the crowd, looking for reassurance, looking for someone to tell him that this was just an illusion. But no one offered him comfort. Instead, I stood with my head held high, a quiet smile playing on my lips, knowing exactly what he didn't, who I really was, and the magnitude of the family that stood, invisibly, beside me. That night marked the beginning of the unraveling of Daniel S. assumptions, the first real step in reclaiming not just my dignity, but my rightful place. He had called me a backup plan, thinking that the game of influence and respect was his alone to control. But he had forgotten one crucial truth. Some people don't need to fight to be noticed. Their presence, their connections, and their family's legacy make their voice impossible to ignore. And for the first time, Daniel was beginning to realize that I was far from a backup plan. After that fateful night when Daniel had called me his backup plan, I knew I couldn't act impulsively. Revenge, or, more accurately, vindication, needed precision. I wasn't looking for petty humiliation. I wanted a revelation that would leave him speechless, a moment that would correct the narrative once and for all. The first step was research. I started observing Daniel S. patterns, his social life, the events he frequented, and, most importantly, the people he relied on to validate his self-importance. He was predictable in his vanity. Every gala, every charity ball, every networking event was a stage for him to perform, to display his so-called influence. And I realized something crucial. He underestimated the people I knew, my family, and the invisible power they wielded. I began my reconnaissance subtly. At small gatherings, I stayed quiet, blending into the background while listening to conversations, noting alliances, weaknesses, and egos. I observed how he interacted with his friends and colleagues, how his confidence faltered when the spotlight wasn't on him. The more I watched, the more I understood the cracks in his armor. Meanwhile, I quietly reconnected with my family. I hadn't lived under their shadow for long, but they had been my safety net, my foundation. My grandfather, a respected businessman, had decades of experience dealing with people like Daniel. My uncle controlled media connections and influential circles, and my aunt was a strategist who could plan social maneuvers that would make even the most cunning manipulators rethink their moves. I didn't need them to fight my battle for me. I needed them as the silent power behind it. We devised a subtle but powerful plan. The key was timing and setting. The revelation had to occur in a public arena where Daniel's ego would be on display, and where the acknowledgement of my true identity would resonate with maximum impact. I wanted the moment to be undeniable, not just to him, but to everyone around him. To prepare, I polished my social presence. Every event I attended was carefully calculated. I didn't flaunt my connections. I let them surface naturally. I allowed the murmurs of recognition and curiosity to spread organically. Influential people began to notice me, not because I announced my lineage, but because I carried myself with a quiet confidence that demanded respect. Daniel, of course, remained unaware. He continued to behave as though I were expendable, a temporary accessory in his curated social life. He would invite me to dinners, expecting compliance and charm, assuming that I had no leverage, no real standing. But each time I accepted politely, masking the storm that was quietly building. Every gathering became a calculated opportunity to set the stage for the final reveal. Then came the turning point, a high-profile charity gala, an event that Daniel considered his crown jewel. This was the perfect stage. Influential figures from the business, media, and social spheres would all be present, and, crucially, Daniel would be at his most arrogant, most distracted, most sure of his dominance. On the night of the gala, I arrived fashionably late, ensuring that all eyes were on the entrance just as I appeared. I wore an elegant gown, understated but commanding attention without effort. The whispers began almost immediately. "Isn't it that? I think that is her. She's related to?" I allowed the speculation to grow, letting the seeds of curiosity take root before delivering the revelation. I navigated the room with quiet grace, greeting a few acquaintances, shaking hands and exchanging smiles. Daniel, across the room, finally noticed me. I saw the recognition flicker in his eyes, followed by confusion, then panic. His carefully constructed composure faltered as he scanned the room, seeking confirmation from his peers, desperate to dismiss what he feared. And then I allowed it to happen. I casually mentioned a small detail: my grandfather's foundation, a recent philanthropic initiative, a connection to a media conglomerate. It was subtle, almost incidental, but the effect was immediate. Heads turned, whispers escalated, and Daniel's friends began piecing it together. Murmurs grew into audible comments. Recognition spread like wildfire. "She's related to the Emersons?" someone asked. "Yes," another confirmed. "I didn't know she was at this event. She's incredible." Daniel's face drained of color. He was scrambling mentally, trying to regain control, but the damage was irreversible. Everyone in the room was connecting the dot. He had thought he could belittle me with impunity, unaware that the woman he dismissed as a backup plan was, in fact, connected to a family whose influence dwarfed his own network. I didn't need to gloat or confront him. The room's reaction was the confrontation. The realization that his underestimation of me was his undoing was written all over his face. He had assumed power and status were his alone, but influence runs deeper than arrogance. It runs through connections, legacy, and reputation, and I had all three. By the end of the night, the whispers had reached Daniel directly. He could no longer hide, could no longer act casual. The room was alive with recognition, curiosity, and admiration for me. His friends, colleagues, and competitors all now knew what he had done, that I was far from a backup plan. I was a force to be reckoned with. I left the gala that night knowing the first part of the plan had succeeded. Daniel's illusion of control had shattered in a single evening. He was forced to confront the truth about who I was and the magnitude of my connections. But the journey wasn't complete. The ultimate revelation, the one that would leave him speechless, humbled, and fully aware of his miscalculation, was still ahead. As I walked out into the night, I felt a surge of calm satisfaction. The whispers of the evening, the subtle nods of recognition, the quiet awe, it was all part of a larger strategy. Daniel had underestimated me once. That mistake had cost him his composure, his confidence, and his perceived dominance. But there was more to come, because the final stage of the plan required patience, timing, and precision, and I had all three. I returned home that night, reviewing every detail of the evening, noting the reactions, and planning the next. My family and I discussed the unfolding strategy, refining it, anticipating Daniel's potential counteractions, and preparing for the decisive moment when he would have no choice but to acknowledge the truth. I realized something important. Power isn't always about wealth or bravado. Sometimes it's about visibility, recognition, and the careful orchestration of events. Daniel had wielded his confidence like a weapon, but it was hollow, lacking substance. My plan, rooted in preparation and execution, was unstoppable. By the time I went to bed, I felt an unfamiliar sense of clarity and control. Daniel S. arrogance had blinded him. My quiet strength, my strategic patience, and my family as support had created the perfect storm. He had labeled me a backup plan, but the universe, and now my careful orchestration, had ensured that the next time he faced me publicly, he would see exactly what he had underestimated. And I knew the day was coming when he would confront the undeniable truth. The days after the gala were electric. I could feel Daniel S. unease without him saying a word. He didn't call, didn't text, but I knew he was thinking about me constantly. People had been talking my name had spread through his social circle like wildfire, whispered in awe and curiosity. Every glance he threw my way at events carried a mixture of confusion, anger, and disbelief. He was realizing, slowly and painfully, that he had misjudged me. I didn't rush the next step. My family had advised patience. Let him stew in his own assumptions, my uncle said, his sharp eyes gleaming behind gold-rimmed glasses. When you strike, it has to leave no room for doubt, no room for him to recover. Make it public, make it undeniable, and most importantly, make it something he can to charm his way out of. So I let him wait. I let him believe he still had control, that the whispers were harmless, that he could casually invite me to events and pretend nothing had changed. Each invitation he sent, each smile he offered, each attempt at casual conversation I met with polite acknowledgement, keeping my distance while maintaining the calm, confident composure that left him unsettled. Then came the opportunity I had been waiting for. A major charity fundraiser hosted at one of the most prestigious venues in the city. Daniel had made it his personal mission to host the event, flaunting his network and influence, calling in favors and connections that he thought would solidify his social dominance. I knew the media would be present. I knew cameras would be rolling. I knew every influential attendee would be there. And I knew the perfect moment to reveal the truth about who I really was would be in front of them all. I arrived at the fundraiser like a shadow at first, slipping quietly through the entrance. My gown was understated but powerful, exuding confidence without shouting for attention. I moved through the crowd with purpose, exchanging greetings with those I had met previously, all the while allowing murmurs of recognition to ripple through the room. The buzz started almost immediately. Daniel saw me and froze mid-conversation. I could feel the tension radiating from him as he scanned the room, realizing that the whispers weren't dying down, they were amplifying. People were looking at me differently now, sizing me up not as a socialite as casual guest, but as someone whose presence carried weight and authority. "Who is she?" I heard someone ask behind me. "Her family. She is one of the Emersons," another whispered. Daniel S. face went pale. I saw him glance toward his closest allies, hoping for reassurance, hoping someone would dismiss it. But the recognition on their faces confirmed what I already knew. They understood who I was, and Daniel S. assumptions had collapsed. I allowed myself a small, controlled smile as I approached the main hall. Cameras from local media outlets were capturing the scene, and reporters were taking note of the subtle stir I had created. Daniel, of course, tried to act casual, attempting to reclaim his composure, but the cracks in his facade were impossible to hide. And then it happened. My grandfather, seated near the center of the room, acknowledged me as his granddaughter during his introductory speech. The cameras caught the exchange, the subtle nods, and the quiet affirmation of my family name. Daniel S.'s expression shifted from confusion to panic. He understood instantly what had been happening behind the scenes, what had been orchestrated long before he arrived. I didn't confront him directly yet. Instead, I let the truth unfold organically. The media coverage was instantaneous. Photos and live streams captured the recognition. People began posting about it on social media. The Emerson granddaughter at Daniel S. fundraiser? Is this the same woman he called a backup plan? Wow. She's related to the Emersons. I watched Daniel struggle to maintain control, realizing that his attempts at charm and influence were futile. He had believed that wealth and connections were his alone, that he could belittle and manipulate others without consequence. But power, as I had learned, isn't about arrogance, it's about strategy, legacy, and the people who stand behind you. As the evening progressed, I executed the next part of the plan. I allowed key guests and influential figures to approach me, casually mentioning philanthropic projects, business ventures, and media initiatives my family was involved in. Each mention was subtle, almost offhand, but the effect was cumulative. Recognition spread like a ripple through the room, building momentum until Daniel's social circle couldn't ignore it. Finally, the moment of reckoning arrived. During a brief break between speeches, Daniel approached me, his confident smile faltering as he tried to mask the fear in his eyes. I didn't realize he began, his voice uncertain, faltering mid-sentence. I looked him in the eye, calm, composed, and unshakable. "You underestimated me," I said softly, my words carrying the weight of months of planning, observation, and strategy. "You assumed I was expendable, someone you could dismiss. But now you see that your assumptions were wrong, completely wrong." He swallowed hard, unable to meet my gaze. "This is your family?" he stammered, his voice betraying both shock and fear. "Yes," I replied, allowing just a hint of satisfaction to color my tone. "And this is only the beginning of understanding who I really am." By the time the gala ended, Daniel was left in a state of quiet disbelief. The whispers, the recognition, and the media coverage had made it clear to everyone who had eyes to see. I was not a backup plan. I was powerful, respected, and connected far beyond anything he had ever imagined. As I stepped into the night air, leaving the gala behind, I felt a sense of calm triumph. This was only the first public shock, the first undeniable evidence that Daniel had misjudged me. The true crescendo, the moment that would completely dismantle his sense of superiority, was still ahead. I knew he was thinking about it, replaying every interaction, every whispered acknowledgement, every glance of recognition. And I knew he was terrified of what was coming next, because he hadn't seen the full extent of my family's influence yet. The final act, the public revelation that would leave him speechless, humbled, and forced to confront the reality of his own arrogance, was coming. And when it did, there would be no room for denial, no room for excuses, no room for charm. Daniel had called me a backup plan. He had assumed he could control the narrative, but the truth, as it always does, had a way of revealing itself, and mine was about to be revealed in the most undeniable way possible. The night had finally arrived. Months of careful planning, subtle positioning, and strategic exposure had led to this single moment. The city's biggest annual gala, a glittering affair of elites, media, and influential figures, was the perfect stage. Daniel had no idea that I would not only be there, but that I would arrive with someone who could shift the balance of power in an instant. I arrived in a sleek, understated car, accompanied not by bodyguards or assistants, but by my grandfather Alexander Emerson, the patriarch of the family whose name carried decades of respect and influence. The entrance was lavish, cameras flashing, reporters murmuring, but my focus was singular. Daniel would see everything, and he would understand the magnitude of his miscalculation in a heartbeat. As we stepped onto the red carpet, whispers spread like wildfire. Guests paused, recognizing the presence of the Emerson patriarch. Their eyes flicked to me, then back to him, then again, as the realization sank in. Daniel, positioned near the center of the gala, froze mid-conversation. His perfectly rehearsed smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of panic. He had underestimated not only me, but the very foundation that supported me. I walked through the crowd with deliberate composure, my grandfather by my side. Each step was calculated, each glance intentional. The murmurs intensified. Cameras caught the two of us moving together, reporters jotting notes and snapping photos. Social media would light up within minutes. This wasn't just a personal revelation. It was a spectacle that could not be ignored. Daniel's friends tried to intervene, offering forced smiles and polite greetings. "Alex," one stammered, trying to maintain composure. "I didn't expect He trailed off, the words failing him. "You didn't expect me to arrive with my family," I said evenly, letting the statement hang in the air. The weight of it was undeniable. Every eye in the room followed me as I moved closer, And Daniel's composure cracked further with each step. Finally, I confronted him directly, not with anger, not with malice, but with the calm, unshakable confidence that only comes from absolute certainty. Daniel, I said, my voice carrying effortlessly over the ambient chatter. Do you remember what you said to me? He swallowed, trying to mask his panic. I don't. You called me your backup plan, I continued, letting the words linger. Do you remember? The color drained from his face. Murmurs rose around us as people began piecing together the story, whispers of curiosity spreading rapidly. Cameras pivoted, catching every reaction, every flicker of fear in his eyes. Yes, he admitted, his voice tight, almost a whisper. I am no one's backup plan, I said, my tone measured and precise. And tonight, everyone here is going to see exactly who I really am and why underestimating me was your biggest mistake. I gestured subtly to my grandfather, Alexander Emerson. The crowd gasped. Influential socialites, business magnate, media personnel, they all recognized the name. Daniel's jaw tightened. He tried to maintain dignity, but his eyes betrayed him. He understood in that instant that his entire narrative of control, influence, and superiority had been shattered. I've been underestimated for far too long, I continued. For months, I've let people believe what they wanted about me. Tonight, the truth speaks for itself. My grandfather stepped forward, placing a hand on my shoulder. Ladies and gentlemen, he said, his voice commanding attention. This young woman is my granddaughter. She has worked tirelessly, with intellect, strategy, and patience, to build her own presence, her own influence, and her own legacy. She is not a backup plan. She is a force, and she deserves recognition for her achievements and her character. The room erupted with murmurs and applause. Daniel's face went pale, realizing that the truth had been revealed far beyond anything he could control. His arrogance, his attempts to belittle me, his dismissive words, all of it lay exposed in front of the city's most influential audience. I let the moment breathe. The cameras clicked, the reporters scribbled notes, and Daniel had no recourse. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words faltered. Every attempt to regain composure, to assert dominance, failed against the undeniable presence and authority of my family and my own poised confidence. Then, to drive the point home, I introduced another key figure, my aunt, a leading strategist in political and social circles. She approached, offering a warm smile to the assembled crowd. Many of you know me, she began, addressing the audience. But tonight, I am here to affirm that influence isn't inherited, it as cultivated, and my niece has cultivated it with extraordinary skill, determination, and intelligence. Those who doubted her, well, let us just say, the evidence is clear. Daniel's shoulders slumped. The weight of the revelation, the undeniable proof of my standing, and the public acknowledgement left him speechless. He had assumed the upper hand, thought himself untouchable, and yet here he was, powerless in the face of truth. The evening continued, but the power dynamic had shifted irrevocably. Daniel avoided eye contact. His friends whispered nervously, and I moved through the room with serene authority. I didn't need to gloat or humiliate him further. His reaction, the collective recognition, and the undeniable exposure were the punishment he deserved. By the end of the gala, the story had spread beyond the walls of the venue. Social media erupted with images and updates. Reporters wrote articles, and the influential circles Daniel had once dominated were now fully aware of the woman he had dismissed. The narrative had shifted, and Daniel's arrogance had been publicly dismantled. I stepped outside into the cool night air, my grandfather at my side, and felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The first phase of revelation had succeeded. Daniel had been confronted with the undeniable truth, publicly exposed for underestimating me, and forced to recognize the power, influence, and respect I commanded. And yet, even as the applause and recognition faded, I knew the ultimate moment of vindication was still to come, the one that would ensure Daniel could never regain the illusion of control he once cherished. The final act would cement the truth once and for all, because he had called me his backup plan, and now, in front of the entire city, he had seen the first glimpse of the reality he had ignored. The final chapter, The complete revelation that would leave him utterly speechless was approaching, and it would be unforgettable. The night of the final reveal was unlike any other. Months of meticulous planning, strategic positioning, and careful orchestration had led to this moment. Every guest at the exclusive fundraising gala had been briefed, or at least subtly guided toward witnessing the ultimate proof of my identity, influence, and power. And Daniel? He had no idea. I entered the grand hall with measured steps, my posture straight, my gaze calm but piercing. Behind me, my family followed my grandfather, the patriarch, my aunt, the strategist, and a few close allies whose accomplishments and influence spoke for themselves. Each of them exuded quiet authority, the kind of presence that made people stop and take notice. Cameras flashed instinctively. Reporters murmured, trying to capture the moment. But all of that was secondary to one thing: Daniel's reaction. I spotted him immediately, standing near the center of the room, surrounded by his circle of friends, his smug smile wavering as he sensed the shift in energy. The moment his eyes landed on me, I could see recognition dawning, and with it, the creeping fear of being exposed. "Daniel," I said, my voice carrying effortlessly across the room, calm, steady, and deliberate. He froze mid-conversation, the people around him glancing at me, sensing the tension. "Do you remember what you said to me?" he stammered, trying to mask the panic in his eyes. I don't. You called me your backup plan," I stated, letting the words linger. "Do you remember that?" His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Whispers began to ripple across the room. Everyone present could sense the brewing confrontation, though few knew the full context. Cameras pivoted, recording every reaction. Daniel's friends exchanged glances, unsure how to respond. He admitted finally, his voice tight, trembling slightly. I stepped closer, letting the silence fill the space between us. "You assumed I was disposable, someone to be underestimated, someone who could be overlooked without consequence. But the truth, Daniel, is far more complicated and far more powerful than your assumptions." I gestured behind me, and my grandfather stepped forward, placing a hand on my shoulder. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice commanding attention and cutting through the murmurs. "This young woman is my granddaughter. She has worked tirelessly to build her own presence, her own influence, and her own legacy. She is not a backup plan. She is a force of intellect, strategy, and perseverance." Gasps echoed across the room. Daniel's expression shifted from disbelief to panic. He understood immediately that his entire narrative of superiority and control had crumbled. His ego, once untouchable, was now exposed before a room full of influential witnesses. "And this," I continued, indicating my aunt and other family allies, "is the network that supports and guides her. Every project she has undertaken, every venture she has led, has been backed by experience, insight, and vision. Those who doubted her well, the proof is before you." Daniel's shoulders slumped as realization hit him. He had believed himself untouchable, assuming that connections, charm, and superficial influence were enough to dominate. But the truth was far more potent. Substance, legacy, and authentic power outweighed arrogance every time. I allowed the moment to breathe, letting the murmurs and camera flashes amplify the message. The whispers of recognition, the social proof of my family's standing, and the undeniable authority I projected created a wave that Daniel could not counter. Then, for the final act, I delivered the ultimate revelation. "Daniel," I said, my voice measured but carrying the weight of finality, "the people you see here, the ones whose respect and influence you once envied, are the ones who have ensured that your assumptions about me were not only wrong, but foolish. You assumed that a name, a moment, or a dismissive comment could define someone's worth. But the reality is clear. Character, determination, and family legacy define power. And you, Daniel, have just witnessed that truth." The crowd, now fully attentive, began to applaud. The applause wasn't just polite, it was acknowledgement, validation, and celebration of the moment. Daniel's attempts to speak were drowned out, his influence nullified by the undeniable presence of authority and recognition surrounding me. I stepped closer, locking eyes with him. You once told me to accept my place as your backup. Tonight, you've seen that your assumptions were completely wrong. You've seen the family, the resources, and the influence that you ignored. You've seen that I am not just my own person, I am part of a legacy that commands respect. Daniel's friends had begun to shift uncomfortably. Some whispered to each other, unsure how to salvage his reputation, while others quietly photographed the scene, capturing the collapse of arrogance in real time. Daniel's face, once confident and dismissive, was now a portrait of disbelief, shame, and fear. From now on, I said, my voice carrying authority that could not be contested, I decide how I am recognized. I decide the circles I enter, the projects I lead, and the influence I wield. You, Daniel, have had your lesson. Let it serve as a reminder. Never underestimate someone whose strength, strategy, and support you cannot see. A murmur of agreement and admiration swept through the room. People were acknowledging the shift in power, recognizing the justice and strategy behind my actions. Daniel's silence was deafening. His former confidence had been utterly dismantled in the most public, undeniable way possible. I turned away, allowing the applause and attention to follow me as I moved through the room. My grandfather's hand on my shoulder reminded me of the foundation behind my victory, the combination of family, strategy, and personal perseverance. The ultimate vindication had been achieved. Daniel's assumptions were publicly and irrefutably shattered, and the narrative was rewritten in my favor. As the night concluded, I stepped into the cool air outside, leaving the gala behind. Daniel remained inside, surrounded by whispers, judgmental glances, and the stark reality of having misjudged someone he thought he controlled. I felt a profound sense of closure. The journey from being dismissed as a backup plan to commanding undeniable authority had been long, calculated, and deeply satisfying. And in that moment, I knew the lesson was complete. The power, the influence, and the recognition that Daniel had dismissed were now fully revealed. No words, no excuses, no charm could undo the truth he had witnessed. He had learned, painfully and publicly, the cost of arrogance and the strength of legacy. I walked away from that night, not with triumph and anger, but with the calm satisfaction of justice served and boundaries firmly established. The final chapter of Daniel's assumptions had been written, and it would not be forgotten.